There's a scene in one of my favorite movies, Braveheart, where William Wallace, played by Mel Gibson, he comes back home as an adult, and his childhood friend Hamish sees him, he greets him, he punches him in the face actually, and he challenges him to a test of manhood. Now this test is to see who can throw a sizable stone the furthest. Hamish is a larger and stronger man, so he ends up winning this bout of machismo. But after losing, Wallace smiles at him and asks him if he thinks that he can do that if he were in war. Hamish, do you think you could crush a man with that throw when it matters most? Hamish says, I could crush you like a worm. Well, Wallace doesn't think he could do that, so he walks a few yards, bends over and picks up a tiny rock while he's walking, and then he stands still. Hamish runs, he throws his massive rock, and it grazes Wallace's hair, and the crowd oohs and ahs because it almost hit Wallace. While smiling, Wallace closes one eye to get his aim and get his distance right, and he chucks this little rock, nailing Hamish right in the forehead, and everyone erupts in laughter. Wallace makes his way to Hamish, and after a brief interaction, Hamish hits the ground because he's dizzy, probably suffering from a concussion. I can't tell you how many times I've watched this movie, and every time I just laugh at this scene. And at some point, I hope the movie changes while I'm watching it. Have you ever watched a movie and just wished it would change? The rock smashes Wallace, end of movie, credit rolls. What just happened? And wouldn't that be embarrassing, though, in the afterlife when you're sharing war stories with your friends? Well, how'd you go out? Well, I was shot by an arrow. Or I was stabbed by a sword. Well, I got hit by a rock. In Braveheart, they're just having some fun. But stoning someone was actually a form of capital punishment for the Jews during the Hebrew scripture days. It's the method of execution most frequently discussed in Torah, and according to the law, you could be stoned for any litany of reasons. One reason, breaking the Sabbath. In Numbers 15, you'd be stoned to death for breaking the Sabbath. The second, being a wizard. In Leviticus 20, if you're a wizard, you blunt force trauma, stoned to death. Another reason, if you rebel against your parents, Deuteronomy 21. Take heed, kids. And the one that we will see referenced today is when a man and a woman are having sex, and the woman is either married or betrothed, engaged to another man, and both parties then, who are caught, are to be stoned to death, from Deuteronomy 22. But before we read that text, a bit about the book of John. Earlier this year, we'd already looked at a bunch of John passages, and saw that this book is mucho different than the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. A person named John, he's credited as the author, but we know that multiple authors partook in the writing of this gospel because we have sections of this book that were added down the road after John, or the guy credited to be John, had passed. And this was the last of the 4 gospels to be written, probably somewhere around 90 to 120 CE, and during this time there were many stories going around about Jesus that just weren't true. Later, these stories would be called heresies. So the main author, John, is writing to a bunch of people who had already converted to this Jesus movement, and he's desperately trying to convince them that Jesus is the Messiah. He doesn't want them to listen to these other stories and essentially just go astray. One thing this book is known for is how the author expresses the deep hostility between the religious leaders and Jesus, which usually the religious leaders are just called the Jews, which we'll kind of see in this text today, the hostility. The early Christian church then used this gospel to inspire them and their political and social resistance towards the authorities of their day. Keep that in mind. Let's go ahead and read from John 8. Early in the morning he came to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them, they said to him, Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now in the law Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say? They said this to test him, so they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and he said to them, Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. And once again he bent down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away, one by one, beginning with the elders, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on, do not sin again." There's so much here in this story. We could cover this text for a month and not talk about everything. It's such a good story. Now, if we were to back up to the previous chapter, in chapter 7, we would see that it was the time of the Festival of Tabernacles. The Festival of Tabernacles is one of the 7 major feasts on the Hebrew calendar. There were spring feasts and there were fall feasts, and they were all organized around the agricultural cycles of planting and harvesting. This was very common in the ancient world and in these agricultural societies. People set aside particular times to thank the gods for the latest harvest, and then ask the gods for continued abundance for their crops and for their future harvest. Now, the Feast of Tabernacles was in the fall, and it was the last of the fall feasts and the last feast of the year. As the last feast of the year, it was the feast right before winter, when hopefully rains would come and water the crops so they'd grow, so that in spring you'd have food to harvest. You know, as we know, if the rains didn't come during the winter, you might not have any food, and you and your family would starve to death. Now, thousands of Jewish pilgrims in the first century would pour into Jerusalem for 8 days of feasting and partying, and they would stay in these makeshift shelters. During these 8 days, there were animal sacrifices, prayers, lots of singing and teaching from the religious leaders, and everything was oriented around asking God to bring the winter rains. Now picture with me, thousands of people in Jerusalem, feasting and drinking and celebrating and chanting and praying and living in makeshift shelters on the side of the hill in Jerusalem. Basically, it's religious camping with a lot of wine involved. And what oftentimes happens when lots of people drink and camp together? You know, you all know, you were around during Woodstock, or you've seen pictures of Woodstock. Of course, you end up in each other's tents. Can you see how 2 people might have easily ended up in the wrong tent? It's not surprising then when the teachers of the law and the Pharisees drag into the temple courts a woman they'd caught having sex with a man who wasn't her husband. Now they bring this woman to Jesus because they want to trap him. And so they challenge him with a passage from the law. Our scriptures say this woman should be killed. What do you say? This woman. Think about that. This woman. Do we all remember that text from Deuteronomy we saw? That both the man and the woman should be put to death? Yet here we are. And only the woman is present. This woman. It feels as if she is made in this text, in this story, to be a non-person. She's given no name, no identifiers. She's only viewed as a sinful woman reduced to an unacceptable sexual object whose body and life is in the hands of those who are in power. This is not only a story of the past, my friends, but an unfortunate reality for so many women still today who are always objectified. This woman, for these religious leaders who without question know the law states that both parties should be executed, they themselves are clearly being hypocritical, choosing to not follow the law and asking Jesus not only his stance on how to respond to the law, but also to determine the value of a life based on the law. And what does Jesus do? He bends down and he writes on the ground. And he's so weird sometimes. One of the passages that was taught at the Festival of Tabernacles, and one the religious leaders would have been very aware of, is from the prophet Jeremiah. The passage is about dust, which we know is what you have if you don't have water. Here are a few lines from there. Lord, you are the hope of Israel. All who forsake you will be put to shame. Those who turn away from you will be written in the dust. What was that last line again? Those who turn away from you will be written in the dust. And what did Jesus do? He bends down and writes in the dust. Jesus takes one of the passages they would have all been familiar with, and he enacts it, all without saying a word. The religious leaders have rejected him, but instead of saying it, he alludes through his actions to a verse they were just teaching, implying that they, the concerned religious leaders, are the ones who have turned away from God, not the woman caught in adultery. You can read this story lots of ways. And one way is to see that it is a wonderful lesson about how we should be less judgmental. Don't throw stones at people when they screw up, because we all screw up from time to time. And it's important not to condemn, but give people grace, because you'd want them to give you grace. Author Brene Brown says, research tells us that we judge people in areas where we are vulnerable to shame, especially picking folks who are doing worse than we're doing. We're hard on each other because we're using each other as a launching pad out of our own perceived shaming deficiency. Condemning others for their mistakes and belittling someone isn't what will lead us back to restoration with God. Everyone knows John 3:16. But John 3:17 says God didn't send God's Son to the world to condemn it, but to save it. Why did this woman's life change for the better after having encountered Jesus? Because he preached good news. This is gospel. She received a new, fresh word about the worth of her humanity. I don't condemn you. No condemnation. Just dignity and value. Now that's one way to read it. And we could all use more grace and less stone throwing for sure. But a second way to read the story is found in Jesus bending down and writing in the dust. The storyteller wants you to see that Jesus is confronting an entire entrenched power structure. These spiritual leaders were part of a temple institution that ruled the Jewish tribe, an institution that controlled politics and religion and economics and cultural life. And this institution had become corrupt in Jesus' day, which is why he confronts them. This is not just a nice story about how we should be less judgmental. This is about political and social resistance towards anything that robs people of their dignity and honor. This story is about the courage and tenacity of this rabbi to stand up and say, no, you are in the wrong. We, as followers of Christ, followers of this same rabbi, must be willing to stand against any force that strips the dignity, honor, and humanity from our neighbors. This can happen on a micro level for example, refusing to join in on a conversation when you hear someone speak belittling words about another person. You could refuse to speak, or it could be you taking a stand for that person whose name is being smeared. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Or this can happen on a macro level, by fighting against any system that oppresses others, even this system called the United Methodist Church, as we are in the middle of a breakup concerning whose love counts more. Jesus lost his life by standing against the powers that be. But in his stance, those around him gained life and were empowered through wholeness. So may you, my friends, have the courage and tenacity to stand for those whose legs have been taken from them. May you be a person who lifts others up in the middle of their mistakes and mishaps, instead of breaking them down. And may others around you experience wholeness and life due to how you live yours. Amen.